Welcome to the next installment in our lecture series for American Economic History online here at Rutgers University. And in this video lecture, what we're going to take a look at is the New Deal. Specifically, what we want to take a look at is government actions in trying to deal with the impact of the Great Depression. So we realized in our previous lectures that in 1929 we had a stock market crash that plunged us into a recession, and a series of events occurred after that that made the recession into a depression, something that lasted for many, many years. Some people argue that we didn't officially move out of the Great Depression until 1941. So we're talking about an economic downturn that lasted roughly a decade. So what we want to take a look at is how government addressed this. And initially, one of the things I want you to realize is that Herbert Hoover was president in 1929, and the philosophy of the Republican Party at that time was very much a laissez-faire attitude, that the government should stay out of markets and that the markets themselves would eventually correct themselves. This is a classical school of thought, classical economics, that yes, there's going to be economic downturns, but if you just leave things alone, eventually prices, wages, etc. will adjust back to the full employment output level. The difficulty with this strategy was that by 1932-33, the economy had not gotten any better, that things had eventually and continued to get worse in the United States. So that the great crash in 1929 of the stock market precipitated a downturn, and a lengthy downturn. It seemed like the economy was getting worse and worse and worse year after year after year. And this led to the election of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to the White House. And with him came along a whole host of strategies to try and improve the economy. And this is what is referred to as, quote unquote, the New Deal. So what we want to take a look at is the aspects of the New Deal and how they were intended to improve the economy. So number one, when we take a look at this, there's a few things I want you to understand. The banking crisis in the United States during the Great Depression, very, very important. Banks were closing at a large level. All right, historical comparisons that you can't even compare the number of banks that shut down and went out of business during the Great Depression. So I want you to be able to understand the scope of the banking crisis. You don't have to know exact numbers, but you have to realize that bank closings were a severe issue during this time period, and what issues were taken to address the banking crisis. In particular, how do you restore confidence in the banking sector? Also, realize that this entailed, not just in banking, but in all sectors of the economy, there was a greater or an expanded role of government as an employer. Government was employing more and more individuals. There was a lot of quote-unquote public works projects that occurred during this time period. In essence, the federal government employed people to do work, to plant trees or to clear forests, to actually build lakes. For example, if you're familiar with this area, Morristown, Strawbridge Lake was a public works project. Originally started by the Strawbridge family, i.e. the name of Strawbridge Lake, but it was finally ended up being finished by the federal government, and what the federal government did was pay individuals to build the lake, to actually construct a lake out of what was previously, I believe that's a tributary of the Pennsauken Creek system. So realize that the government takes a much expanded role in employing as an employer in the economy. We also want to have an idea of changes to labor law and the implementation of Social Security. In particular, we'll take a look at implications of child labor and also the impact of Social Security. And then we'll take a look at all these public works projects that I discussed previously, how large they were. So number one, make sure you understand what happened in the banking sector, but I want you to understand how the banking sector grew in the United States prior to the Great Depression. And those numbers there give you a good idea. For example, between 1900 and 1914, the number of commercial banks had doubled in the United States. And then from 1914 to 1921, we still continue to see banks growing, but the number of banks growing, but we see this at a much smaller rate. So the increase was slowing down by the early 1920s. So these numbers here, you could take a look at the bank failure. So when the stock market crashed in 1929, there were 700 bank failures. And in 1930, there were 1,300 bank failures. 1931, 2,300. 1932, the number of bank failures abated in the economy, going down to 1,400. And by 1933, there was a whole new slew of bank failures, to the point where 38 states had suspended operations of banks. So I want you to realize that, in essence, the entire banking system in the United States came crashing down during the Great Depression. So I want you to realize that number one of the crash, the stock market crash, as impetus for the start of the Great Depression. But then we have a whole series of events, including the collapse of the banking system, that further caused the economy to move downward. So this caused FDR to call a national bank holiday. In essence, what the national bank holiday was is that FDR closed all the banks, had all the banks inspected, and then the ones that were still solvent were allowed to reopen. In essence, he was doing this to bolster confidence in the banking system. That if a bank that was closed under the national bank holiday and had been inspected and was financially solvent, then individuals believed that the banks that were still in operation were viable, that they weren't going to lose their money. This is what oftentimes referred to as a bank panic, when people en masse withdraw their money. Remember, as we talked about previously, that the banks operated under, and still operate under, a fractional reserve system, meaning they only have to keep a fraction of deposits on hand to redeem individuals who want them, who want that money. This is fine, but if everybody comes in to get their money at the same time, the banks don't have that money, so they have to shut down because they can't give the deposits back to individuals who deposit their money. In essence, they have a short-term liquidity problem, or they're insolvent is another potential reason for that. Well, the problem with this is that people start to have doubts about not the bank, but the banking system. So you can imagine in the 1920s, 1930s, if there are 3 or 4 banks in your city, and one of the banks shut down, people have a tendency to believe, well, if that bank is unstable, then maybe my bank's unstable. So what do? To be safe, they go to the bank to remove their money. Well, if majority of the depositors want to take their money out of the bank will not have that cash on hand, and it has to shut down. So you can see how one bank failure can lead to a wave of bank failures, because people gradually start to lose faith in the banking system and want to withdraw their funds. All right, after the holiday, the 4,000 banks were found to be solvent, and the present chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, as part of most of the research he has done is on the banking system, particularly in the Great Depression, found that this crisis was so severe that the banking system, in essence, was unable to act as a financial intermediary for the remainder of the 1930s. And just be aware of some of the laws that were passed relative to the Emergency Bank Act. One, it provided that specie could not be exported from the United States. Gold and silver could not be exported from the United States. So it was trying to maintain the supply of gold in the United States and maintain. Remember, we were on a gold standard at the time. So if gold flew out of the country or was exported out of the country, that decreased the amount of money that was available in the United States. So the United States government wanted to make sure that there was enough specie on hand to back the paper money that was in the United States. And it also provided for temporary deposit insurance. What we take for granted today as FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, did not exist in the 1930s. So if your bank went under, your deposits were gone. You were not insured against the loss of your deposits when your bank failed. So these were two measures to bolster confidence in the banking system. Realize that there was a whole host of governmental agencies. The National Industrial Recovery Act was passed. And the reason for this, I want you to understand some of the reasons for the passage of these laws. That individuals found that firms were competing against themselves to the level that this competition was damaging to the industries. That the competition was causing firms to go out of business, which was causing people to be laid off, that was making the unemployment rate even worse. All right? And also the fact that there were so many firms going out of business because of this competition, that this raised risk. That if you're going to go into an industry where the failure rate's high, people will not likely go into that industry. So if you know that within a year, 50% of the businesses who open in this industry fail, you're not going to enter into that marketplace. So that increased the risk levels. It made the reality of business failure to increase and unemployment more likely. So realize that the National Industrial Recovery Act allowed businesses to actually collude. It actually allowed anti-competitive policies among companies. We talked about previously that this is a reversal. Remember, we talked about the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prevented firms from colluding and decreasing competition. Now we have acts coming out of Congress that actually allow businesses to collude and allow businesses to decrease the level of competition. The National Industrial Recovery Act allowed businesses to organize into identifiable industries. So the industries were allowed to segment into subsectors. They came up with a code of fair practice that all of the businesses within that industry had to adhere to. It also allowed for collective bargaining for workers. So there was a labor element in this, and you should be aware of that labor element of the National Industrial Recovery Act. Also realize that this National Industrial Recovery Act was found unconstitutional after enactment. So I want you to make sure you realize that that's one element of the NIRA. Realize that parts of the NIRA lived on. The National Labor Relations Board lived on, and the Public Works Administration lived on. These were subparts of the National Industrial Recovery Act. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was established to deal with falling farm prices. Farm prices fell by 50% from 1929 to 1933. You can imagine the impact that this had on farmers and the farming sector. In any business, if you're selling a product for $100 and then 4 years later you can only sell it for $50, that's going to have a dramatic impact on your revenues. All right? Particularly in an area where the people are out of work, you're not going to see an increase in demand for any of the products that are being produced. So what the Agricultural Adjustment Administration did was actually induce farmers to produce less output. So its goal was to reduce supply to increase farm prices. In actuality, portions of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, what they did is they actually would purchase products from the farmers and destroy them. So one, it decreased the supply, but the farmers still got paid for the production of those products. It provided a subsidy to the farmers and also provided for a price floor. All right, so realize that. The government purchased these products to keep them off the market. They paid farmers not to plant, and they paid farmers not to take land out of production. So you can see what the impact of this is of trying to raise farm prices, because the farm sector was particularly devastated by the Great Depression. But economists will argue about the efficiency of paying people not to do something. So we could see arguments against this on efficiency grounds. Also realize there were financial reforms, the Glass-Steagall Act. All right, the Glass-Steagall Act separated banks from security operations, which was lifted in the 1990s, I believe, under Clinton. So banks had to be separate from the operations of bonds and securities, etc., which is not the case today. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation provides deposit insurance so that if banks fail, your deposits do not disappear. You're not wiped out because your bank went bankrupt. Also, it allowed for the restructuring of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was now allowed to set bank reserves and also set margin requirements for loans that were made for the purchases of stock. We talked about how these margin loans or these call loans were a major factor in the speculation that occurred in the stock market. Now the Federal Reserve had some control over loans that were made for the purchase of stocks in a speculative manner, and it was also the provision for the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission to make sure there were fair practices in the marketing and the sale of stocks and other securities. Realize that the government became a large employer during this time period. We have the Civilian Conservation Corps. We have the Works Progress Administration. These entities paid individuals to engage in conservation activities, build water and sewer systems and roads, basically building infrastructure. It took those individuals who were unemployed and actually put them to work. And realize the scope of this. The Works Progress Administration had 8 million people employed by 1941. Roughly 16% of the labor force was employed and being engaged in producing these public works. So you can see how important the federal government became as an employer during this time period. Also, let's take a look at the impact on labor, particularly the Wagner Act is important. It mandated collective bargaining. That companies had to recognize unions and had to allow them to bargain collectively in these industries. So this helped to increase the level of unionization in the United States. And it specifically stated that labor had a right to organize, elect their own bargaining agents, and to bargain collectively. And also we talk about the National Labor Relations Board, which came up if there were disputes between unions and these employers, that the National Labor Relations Board acted as a moderator for these issues when they came up. Also during the Great Depression, during the New Deal, we see the implementation of Social Security, providing income for older individuals. Also provided a mechanism for prepaid unemployment benefits and also gave relief for blind and dependent children. So there's also a component for people with disabilities with Social Security. We talk here about the Fair Labor Standards Act. So this gave the federal government the ability to regulate wages, hours, and working conditions. So I want you to realize that the Fair Labor Standards Act, the importance to labor, particularly in the regulatory power it gave to the federal government in setting wages, hours, and working conditions. It set minimum wages. It mandated that overtime be paid at 1.5 times the regular rate. And it also had penalties for the use of child labor. Also, the electrification of rural areas. All right, we have the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, brought millions of farmers onto the electrical grid. Realize that nowadays we take for granted that electricity is available. In the 1930s, not everybody had electricity. We're not on, quote unquote, on the grid. So that was a program to bring electricity to farmers who did not have electricity. We have the Tennessee Valley Authority, who who dammed up and created electricity from these dams in the Tennessee Valley area and provided electricity for a poorer part of the United States. All right, because private companies did not provide electricity to many areas.